Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Behrens and we're going to be doing a drawing workshop together today. First, let's take a look at some examples of some drawings I've made and then I'll do some demonstrations for you. Let's get started. This first drawing is of two blue herons that I created with pencil, also known as graphite. My intent was to keep the drawing pretty loose, but also to go in and try to define things, try to show detail, and have it kind of come forward and pop out a bit and look three-dimensional, even though it is pretty loose and gestural. Gesture is something that we will talk about in a little bit later on. Next is a little brown bat that I drew using Sharpie markers and micron pens. Actually, a couple of different sized micron pens, so I could get really tiny lines and go a little bit thicker. I do a lot of screen printing, and to do that I need to have drawings that have really clean lines. So here you're just seeing black lines on a white piece of paper so that I can burn my screen properly and have nice clean images to print on paper or t-shirts. So this drawing was created with that in mind, but I also wanted to stick with showing that three-dimensional quality. So he does look a little more realistic, but showing a ton of detail. You can see his little skeletal structure and his wings, and I used hatching and cross-hatching, fills, and a little bit of stippling just to show the detail of the skin that make up his wings, to show the fur on the body, and also give detail to his face so that everything can kind of stand out. And finally, we have here a lemon with a little wedge sliced out of it sitting on top of a cream-colored upside-down bowl. This was done in graphite, same as the first drawing, and I approached it in a different way. This one has more value that I included and is not quite as gestural as the blue herons, but is still kind of loose. I'm using my pencil a little differently with various amounts of pressure put on the paper so that I can have a little more control and make my marks a little softer looking. If you notice the lemon wedge itself, I really go in with a lot of detail to try to show the translucent, fleshy area with the seeds, and also to show the value of the shadow from the bowl and from the lemon itself sitting on the bowl. So this is just a different approach using value, using really light grays to the darkest grays. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to show you some ways you can approach drawing whether you have years of drawing experience or you don't have very much drawing experience at all. We're going to focus on observational drawing, and I'll talk you through a couple of exercises that are a great help with this type of drawing and ultimately will help you with drawing from memory or from your imagination. The first two practice exercises we'll do together are part of my regular drawing warm-up. They're meant to familiarize or refamiliarize you with the subject you're looking at, and this works whether you're drawing from life or from a photo. Before I even touch my pencil or pen to paper, I start off just by looking and observing. I notice the shapes that make up the object, compare sizes of sections with other sections, the texture of the object, whether it looks soft, smooth, bumpy, rough, jaggedy, or whatever, and I try to notice anything else that may be interesting for that particular subject. I'm observing and taking in all of the little nuances of my subject matter. For my blind contour drawings, I've decided to draw a lemon and a shell. You can choose whatever you may have available. It could be the same thing as what I'm drawing. It could be a rock. It could be a feather. It could be a plant. Whatever you can find that's not going to be too complicated, especially if you haven't ever done this before. So what we're going to do here is follow the edge of the object. So we're going to start with the lemon, and our eyes are going to be slowly going around the edge of the lemon, and as our eyes are tracing the lemon, we're actually going to follow along simultaneously with our pencil. You can use a regular graphite pencil. You can use what I'm using a Conti pencil. You can use Sharpie markers, a charcoal, whatever it is that you have. But you're just going to go really, really slowly. And if you notice, I'm just following along every little bump all around the edges. And the first couple of times you draw this, it might look totally crazy. It may not feel like a very circular or oval-shaped lemon, but the more you do this, the closer it'll start looking like a lemon. And the same thing goes for the shell. So as you're tracing around, you want to try to keep your pencil down the entire time. You don't want to lift up your pencil. You want it to be a continuous line. So even if you're dragging it around and it may feel like it's barely touching, you're still following all of the edges in a continuous line. And if it needs to double up a little bit, that's okay. Just keep following. So here you can see I'm working through the little spaces, the little openings in the shell, and I'm making my way up, and I'm actually just staring right at the shell. I'm not looking down at my paper. That's the whole idea of this. You're trying really hard not to cheat, and it is pretty difficult, but the more times that you do this and the more you really try to force yourself not to look down on your paper, the more it's going to help you and the better you're going to get. I can tell you the first bunches of times that I did this exercise myself, my objects looked crazier, much crazier. And now, as you can see, my shapes actually almost come to a complete end of the shape. So it does get better over time. Here are a couple of examples of blind contour drawings that I've done in the past. The top two are of a garlic bulb with a little green stem that started growing out from the top. And the bottom two are from that lemon drawing that I showed earlier that had the wedge cut out. So you can see the wedge and you can actually see the lemon itself. And it looks a little jaggedy and maybe like a 5-year-old could have drawn it, but it is an observational exercise and it really helped prepare me for my final drawing of my lemon. In case you're not exactly sure what these examples are of, the top drawing, blind contour drawing, is of the geranium petals of a plant I have. And that one looks especially crazy. And the bottom one is of trumpet flowers, and you will see the final of this drawing later on. So you'll be able to see how this helped get me warmed up for that. Once you're done with your contour drawings, we're going to move on to gesture drawings. Remember, contour drawings are following the edges of your objects with your eyes and your pencil, and you're pretty much creating an outline showing all the detail. Now with gesture, you are trying to find the essence, get the feel of what the object is, whether it's a solid mass or a light, delicate object. The entire point of this exercise is to get the feel of whatever it is that you're drawing. So now here, we are going to create a gesture of a lemon. The lemon is very round and very solid and sturdy, so we need to show that and get the feeling of that on paper. So I'm using a Conti crayon and drawing with it on its side so I can really fill in and try to sculpt the mass, the massive feeling of it. And I press a little bit harder where I want to show that it's heading back and it's a little bit more dimensional. And this is more of an energetic, faster paced drawing than your contour drawing. Then when I shift over to the shell, It's a lot more delicate than that lemon is. So I'm trying to follow the shape of it still, but I'm also working through it and a little bit airier with it, maybe not pressing quite as hard so I can show a little bit more of the delicate nature of it, but I'm still adding in the texture and those holes and spaces in the shell, just trying to get the feel of it, the curves of it, the smoothness of it, and the unique quality of it. This exercise can be done with anything living or inanimate. You can do it with people and showing poses, as long as you're getting the feel, the gist, the essence of whatever it is the pose is, even if the pose is a lemon or a shell laying flat on a table. I have included a couple of samples of gesture drawings that I've done. So we're back to the trumpet flowers again. We saw the contour drawing of it earlier, and now here's my version of a gesture drawing I did of the same flowers. So this really came in handy once I went on to that final drawing. I know I mentioned that earlier, but we'll get to that final drawing at the very end. This example is actually a fun one for me. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we had that hurricane, I sat at my kitchen table, and as I noticed the trees and the leaves whipping around, not the trees whipping around, but the leaves whipping around on the trees, and it was getting a little bit scary, I was sitting and actually doing some observational drawing and tried to show some of the motion and the craziness of the weather going on. So that's what I tried to accomplish here. And it's just a quick gesture drawing, but I felt like it gave the gist of what was happening that day. Now that we've gone through our warm-up exercises, we're going to shift gears a little bit and move on to form and value. So if we have something that we've already sketched out, I'm going to use my trumpet flower drawing for an example. Then we have it outlined, but we want to actually give it some life or give it some dimension. So what is it that we can do to tackle that? There are 3 different things that we're going to go over, and I'm going to start off with line weight. So with line weight, as you can see, I'm starting off outlining my petals of my flower, and then I start working within them, and I'm working with a heavier line and a lighter line. I'm showing you my examples on my iPad with my Apple Pencil because I'm going to use the same image for the 3 different versions that we're doing. So you can do this in pencil or marker or whatever other material you have. But the whole purpose of line weight, working with line weight, is to have a darker, thicker, heavier line for something that you may want to stand out a little bit more. It'll come forward and pop out visually. And then something that you want to set back a little bit more, you will use a lighter, thinner line. So this is definitely more of an outlined version of these examples that we'll be doing together. But as I work through my petals, you notice that I press a little bit harder and then I try to lighten up a little bit. And it's great with my Apple Pencil because it gives a similar feel to what it would look like if I was just drawing in graphite with a regular pencil. You can do these practice drawings using the same image that I am using. So working from the same subject matter, or if you have your own subject matter that's totally different. But the whole purpose is to think about the thickness and thinness of your lines so that you can show that change in space and kind of change of importance and what you want to pop out and what you want to set back. It helps give a little bit of dimension when you're in kind of an outline mode of drawing. So I'm just slowly making my way around my flower petals just to see what works. If you need to erase and lighten up some lines, you can do that. If you need to go back over your lines to darken them up or thicken them up a little bit, you can do that. And you can take your time with this. I'm not going to go through the entire drawing because if I really wanted to have a complete drawing, it would take a long, long time. So we're just going to do 2 of the flower, trumpet flowers that we'll be seeing here. So we're just going to do 1 at a time. And if you want one flower to look like it's popping out a little bit more than the other, then that's another great thing to use line weight for as well. So you can use line weight within one of the flowers, and then you can also use it when you're comparing the 2 flowers together. So the front flower in general might be a little bit darker, and even if you use some of those lighter line weight marks in there, that totally works too. But then you also want to think about how you can approach another flower if you're going to have a flower that might be sitting a little bit behind the first flower. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to make those lines a little bit lighter, or are you going to make them about the same darkness? If they're the same darkness, then they look like they're sitting at approximately the same place on the same plane on your paper. So it does help if you try to be aware and think about your space and where everything is meant to sit. So once you're happy with certain areas, you can either leave them as they are, or maybe you'll think that you want to go back in and make some tweaks. Maybe you need to darken up your lines a little bit and work back in them. But just make sure that you're working with your entire subject together. So that means that you're looking at the whole thing and seeing how everything works together. That way things will make sense spatially where they sit on the page. So as I'm working on my back flower, I'm comparing the lightness of my lines to what I'd already done in my front flower. So maybe starting off a little bit lighter will really help so that I can decide if I need to go darker or stay lighter. So this is good to just play around with, and you're not going to make any mistakes. It's really just a matter of thinking about what you want to come forward more. Remember, it's going to be darker and thicker, and what you want to set back a little bit is going to be lighter and thinner. So just keep those two ideas in your mind while you're working with line weight. Any little finishing touches you want to add in, just go for it. Once you have everything in there, then you can decide what's going to make it all come together and look the way you want. I'm going to continue working with my trumpet flowers and show you some different mark making techniques that can be used to help show form in your subject or just for some added interest. So to start off, I'm going to outline my petals just so I can have my marks contained in something. You can play around with these techniques just in and of themselves and see what you create. You can make something that's more abstract. You can start drawing them in and see what comes of them. So to start off, I'm making hatching lines. So they're just straight lines, curvy lines, close together lines. They can be sideways, they can be straight up and down, they can start getting closer together or more spread apart to give an illusion that something is getting closer or farther away. Next, I'm using cross-hatching lines, and basically they're just a bunch of tic-tac-toes, and you can have them look like regular tic-tac-toes where it's just straight up and down vertically and side to side horizontally overlapping, or you can curve them in various directions. You can layer them over themselves so you have multiple tic-tac-toes that are just piled on top of each other. The more that they're layered on top of each other, the more it looks a little bit darker because they're just closer together clusters of the lines. The more spread apart they are, the more they give kind of a lighter effect. The next is a fill. So fill is basically just coloring in. So you can have a solid color, solid gray, solid black, whatever color you're working with. And if you think about it, I know we were talking about line weight and how those dark, thick lines will come forward. They kind of pop out more to your eye if you're working with line. If you are coloring in and adding a whole bunch of textures, when you have a big dark spot, it actually sinks into the drawing. So having a fill in my trumpet flowers here help to actually give that center area where it looks like it's sinking in a bit more into the middle and looking like it's going back and receding for that three-dimensional look. Now moving on to stippling, which is actually just a bunch of little dots. So those little dots can get clustered together or they can be spread out apart. The closer they are together, the more they give the illusion of looking like it's a bit darker. The more spread out they are, they give an illusion of light and airiness. And the last thing is scribbling. And yes, it's something that you have probably not done in a long, long time, because that was something that you did when you were a little kid. But scribbling is a real thing, and I do use it in my drawings here and there. So it can be a little bit sloppier, as long as it's kind of a targeted scribble with whatever you're trying to do intentionally. But it can be tighter together, it can be more spread apart, it can be in a small area, but you can play around with scribbling. So I'm showing you the different techniques in the first flower petal, and now we're doing it in the second flower petal, playing around with them as well. So playing around with the scribbling techniques and seeing where they may work, maybe in the veins of the flower petals. And then adding in the fill to that center portion of the flower so it looks like it's sinking in a bit more. Adding in hatching. Hatching can be more precise or a little bit sloppier. Depends on what you're going for. If you want it to be a really precise drawing, you want them to be really nice and tidy. If you want it to be a looser, more gestural drawing, you can have them a little bit looser, and gives it a little bit more energy and activity. And then checking out where the stippling might work best. Playing around with these different techniques are actually a lot of fun. You can decide on just one of these techniques when you're doing this process, or playing around with 2 of them or 3 of them or all of them. You can start off with something and decide that it's not working for you, or maybe you're not sure if it's working properly, so it's totally fine to erase and try again. Keep going until you're happy with the look, and see if you can add on, take away, and just keep building until you get something that you're happy with. It actually is a lot of fun to play around with this. Whether this is a technique that you do often or here and there, it's definitely worth giving it a try and seeing what you can come up with. The last example that I will do for you is using value. So we're going to continue with the trumpet flowers that I've been working on for the last few drawings, and we're going to fill in the value. So when I think about adding value to a drawing, I'm thinking about a few different things. First of all, the object that I am drawing is most likely not going to be in black and white. It's most likely a color object. So what you have to do is change it into a black and white image or grayscale. So you can either do this by taking a photo of it and changing it into a black and white image, so that can help you. But the more practice you get, the more you're able to do this yourself in your head and just kind of looking at it and changing it by comparing it to a value scale. So a value scale, basically, you start off with your lightest light, which is going to be white, the white of your paper, and your darkest dark, which is black. So that would be the darkest shadow or the darkest spot that you have on your object that you're drawing. So you have your light, and you have your dark, and you have your grays in between. So you have to start gradually. So you go from white and then a little bit darker, so it's a really, really light gray. And then you go a little bit darker and a little bit darker until you have a middle gray, and even darker and darker and darker and darker until you get to your black. So then you have your range of white, grays, and black, and that's what you need to integrate into your drawing. So the way I approach this is starting off pretty light generally. So as you can see here, I'm using my iPad again with my Apple Pencil, and I am able to use my Apple Pencil in a way very similar to drawing with pencil on paper. I'm able to draw really lightly, press really light pressure so that I can get my nice light grays, and then as I press a little bit harder, my grays can get even darker and darker and darker until I get to black. So I just gradually build it up. I start off nice and light, and I work my way around because I want everything to blend together and work together. And I start gradually building it up. And if you notice, the way I draw, the direction I move my pencil, I'm trying to follow the shape and the form of the flower petals. So no matter what you're drawing, whatever it is, if it's a three-dimensional thing, you want to follow the shape of it in the direction that makes sense. You want to follow the form so that it doesn't end up looking flat. So now if I approached drawing this and filling in the value with lots of horizontal lines or vertical lines, it would make my object, my flower, look really flat. And if I haphazardly scribble in all over the place in every direction, then it may not make so much sense either, and it may end up looking a little more abstract. So I try to follow the form, the natural direction of the petals so that I can show a little bit of a curve. I can show that it's dipping in maybe a little bit more towards the center, but that's a big part in drawing value. You want to follow the shape as though you're sculpting it. Now, as I said before, I start pretty light and I try to build up. Generally, you don't want your value drawings to look totally outlined, otherwise it doesn't have that natural feel of a value drawing. You want your edges to match whatever color value you're working on at that area. If it's darker, if it's almost a black because it's right near a shadow, then you can have that outlined edge closer to that. But if it's a lot lighter, then you need your edge of that petal or whatever you're drawing to be lighter. You want it to match the inside area. And the other thing I want to mention is, in addition to following the shape and following the curves with your pencil strokes, with your mark making, if you're trying to build up your marks and you start off really light and then you need to go a little bit darker and a little bit darker, sometimes the way to do that is overlapping in different directions, especially when you're working on paper. You start coloring in with your pencil, shading in one direction, and then you build it up by going in a different direction, kind of like cross-hatching, and then you build it up and build it up and build it up, and you make your cross-hatchings right next to each other. But as long as you have your final top layer of pencil heading in the direction that follows that shape, the proper shape of your object in the proper form, then it'll make sense and it'll look like a nice fluid mark making drawing that makes sense. So you want your final marks to go in the proper direction so it has a little more of a realistic feel to it. Otherwise, it might end up looking a little flat. So the main idea with value is to get that three-dimensional quality. Also, one more thought. When you're thinking about your darkest darks, I know I mentioned that it's your shadows that's usually where your darkest darks are going to be. But when we were talking before about line weight, we were talking about how the darkest, thickest mark pops forward. When you're making a value drawing, if you have a black area, it actually flattens and sinks into the drawing. So if you notice the center of this flower where there's the darkest marks, it actually gives the illusion that it's sinking in towards that center part. So it kind of makes sense that it's really dark there because that is the most sinking down, farthest away part of this drawing. The petals are what's popping forward, and the lightest areas show maybe the light from the sun that's shining down on it, or if it's like the light color of the petal itself. Let's take a moment to talk about skill versus creativity. Whether you're an experienced or inexperienced artist, sometimes it feels a little overwhelming getting those ideas from your head onto paper. Doing these observational exercises we've gone through will help you get more comfortable noticing shapes and details, and the more practice you have with that, the more skilled an artist you'll become. Having these tools will ultimately give you more freedom for creativity. Once you know you have the ability to draw resembling the thing it was based on, it gets a lot easier to take the ideas filling your head and sketching them out onto paper, even if it's a loose and kind of sloppy sketch to start with. Then you can look up visual references, whether they're photos or from life, and trust that you have the tools for observing and recording the shapes and lines of your subject and how they fit and work together so that you can transform your sketches into a more coherent drawing. The more you practice, the more comfortable you get, and the easier it gets to create a beautiful work of art. To wrap up, I wanted to show you my final drawing, my final version of my trumpet flowers. I decided to take a soft value drawing approach to this. I used graphite pencil, and I actually also added in something new for me. I used graphite powder. So I was able to actually paint my pencil into my drawing using my graphite powder and a paintbrush, which was pretty cool. I could be very soft and delicate and smooth with my value changes. I also went in with an eraser to lift up anything that I felt was too dark, or if I really needed a light gray in there. So, what do you think? I think it's done.